Genesis is unique in being one of the most influential prog rock bands in the history of music, and at the same time enjoying household name mainstream success in the pop market. Genesis pioneered the prog rock genre in the late 60s and early 70s, together with classic bands like Pink Floyd, King Crimson, Yes, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Van de Graaff Generator, and many, many others. It has also sold a stunning 150 million albums in total, with a string of #1 albums and top 10 hit singles during the 80s and early 90s. The history of Genesis can be divided into two distinct periods, though there is some debate about where to exactly put the dividing line. Some people regard singer Peter Gabriel's departure of the band in May of 1975 as the watershed moment, and talk about the Gabriel period and the post-Gabriel period. Others identify the moment when guitarist Steve Hackett left in August of 1977 as the cutoff point. Following this, the three remaining members, singer and drummer Phil Collins, bassist and guitarist Michael Rutherford, and keyboardist Tony Banks, shifted musical direction. While remaining loyal to the band's prog rock roots, they started to write shorter, catchier songs with more straightforward structures that were promoted with videos that appealed to the MTV generation. The result was enormous commercial success on a scale that dwarfed what the band had enjoyed before. In this video, we will focus on the first 10 years of Genesis, from its foundation in 1967 to the departure of Steve Hackett in 1977, and look at exactly what made the band one of the most influential and successful exponents of the prog rock genre. In the second video, we will examine what could be called the prog pop era of Genesis, and how the band managed to achieve household name success. The origins of Genesis are as un-rock and roll as it gets. Famously, the band was formed at Charterhouse, an independent boarding school for 13 to 18-year-olds in Surrey, southern England. Founded in 1611, Charterhouse is one of Britain's most famous elite schools. It charges a considerable amount for tuition and boarding, and as a result, its pupils are from well-off families and the upper classes. It was in this prestigious environment that Michael Rutherford and guitarist Anthony Phillips started a band called Anon, while Gabriel, Banks and drummer Chris Stewart formed a group called Garden Wall. When these two school bands fell apart, Gabriel, Banks, Rutherford, Phillips and Stewart got together to found another band, which they called the New Anon. It was 1967 and they were 16 or 17 years old. Despite the elitism and privilege that surrounded the members of the quintet, their attraction to rock music was based on a rebellious spirit that also showed itself in their lack of interest in doing schoolwork. Michael Rutherford recalled,
"I was banned from playing the guitar throughout my entire career there. I'm not quite sure why. I guess maybe at that stage pop music was a sort of a symbol for the revolution that was about to overthrow the establishment and bring the country down."
The New Anon started writing their own songs and recorded some of them at a local demo studio. They gave a cassette tape with these recordings to Jonathan King, a Charterhouse alumni who passed by the school one evening for a reunion. King was about 6 years older and had already achieved chart success. He was particularly impressed with Peter Gabriel's singing and offered to produce an album. He also named the quintet Genesis. King paid for and produced several recording sessions at Regent Sound Studios in August and December of 1967, and arranged for a record deal with Decca. However, there very quickly were created differences between the band and King. To impress him, Gabriel and Banks co-wrote a song called The Silent Sun, inspired by the Bee Gees, a band they knew King adored. The song was released in February of 1967, but it flopped. A second single also flopped. In August of 1968, the band recorded its debut album at Regent Studio One in London on 2 4-track tape recorders, with a new drummer, John Silver. King produced the album and suggested the title From Genesis to Revelation. Because there was a band in the US called Genesis, the album was released with just its title on the cover, which had the unexpected drawback that it ended up in the religious section of many record shops. As a result, it sold just 649 copies in its first year. Unsurprisingly, King and the band stopped working together. Despite the fact that Oasis singer Noel Gallagher has declared himself a fan of the album, there's little originality on the album. Genesis also disliked the mix and quickly moved on. Undeterred by their early failure, the band members decided to become professional musicians and record more demos at the end of 1969. However, they were rejected by all labels that heard them. It led to Silver leaving the band. He was replaced by drummer John Mayhew, who also was a carpenter and from a completely different social background. During the autumn and winter of 1969 to 1970, Genesis spent many months writing and rehearsing at a cottage owned by the parents of Richard MacPhail, who had been the vocalist in the Charterhouse school band Anon and went on to become the band's tour manager. The five musicians would routinely spend up to 12 hours per day rehearsing. Once they felt that the material was ready, Genesis began performing in venues around London, eventually graduating to support act of the likes of Atomic Rooster, Deep Purple, and Fairport Convention. Producer John Anthony saw Genesis perform live at the beginning of 1970 and introduced them to Tony Stratton Smith, a former journalist who had founded Charisma Records the year before. The label had already released albums by Van der Graaf Generator and Atomic Rooster and would become one of the most important folk and prog rock labels in the UK, also signing acts like Lindisfarne, The Nice, the Alan Parsons Project, Hawkwind, Rick Wakeman, and more. Stratton Smith acted as a manager and a mentor to Genesis and several other acts. Genesis went into Trident Studios in June of 1970 to record the band's debut album for Charisma. Producer John Anthony and engineer Robin Jeffrey Cable recorded the material to 16-track. The resulting album was called Trespass and released in October of 1970 with a striking cover by Paul Whitehead. It contained the first expressions of Genesis' unique prog rock sound that incorporated folk, classical, pop, soul, rock, and other influences.
Well, I think with Trespass that we kind of feel is really the first kind of proper Genesis album. The Genesis Revelation stuff was songs we'd kind of written with the original intention of other people doing them, and no one else would do them, and then we sort of modified them a bit so they fit this kind of broad concept we had, and then just recorded them while we almost just left school. Very simple. We never played live or anything, and we just I played mainly piano on it and stuff. By the time we did Trespass, we'd been playing on the road for a few months, and we had a whole, obviously about an hour and a half's worth of material, and we just recorded what we thought were the sort of better ones for Trespass.
Trespass features several trademark sounds of early Genesis, including the use of a mellotron and multiple 12-string guitars for more pastoral sections, with Phillips, Rutherford and Banks playing Hagstrom and Rickenbacker guitars. The tempo, mood and texture shifts in the longer songs are typical of prog rock, and particularly noticeable in the longest and hardest rocking track on the album, The Knife, which became a live fan favourite. Gabriel's striking voice commands attention on the entire album. Critical reactions to Trespass were mixed. Although it went to number 1 in Belgium, it sold poorly in the UK. On top, guitarist Anthony Phillips, who had been the de facto leader of the band, had become increasingly uncomfortable with the musical direction of the band, and even more so with the pressures of live performance. His stage fright became so pronounced that he left the band in July of 1970.
We thought that if one of us left, we couldn't carry on. And I reckon the closest we came to busting up was when Anthony left.
Phillips' departure caused a major crisis for the remaining members, but Banks, Gabriel and Rutherford decided to continue, not only to find a new guitarist, but also a different drummer more suitable to their music. Advertisements were placed in the main music magazine of the day, Melody Maker. Phil Collins was one of many drummers who auditioned, and he joined the band in August of 1970. He was chosen because of his vocal talents as well as his skills behind the drum kit, and because he fit in well on a personal level, despite not being from a middle-class background. The search for a suitable guitarist continued for several months, with Tony Banks attempting to play lead guitar lines using a pianette and a distortion box. The band also tried guitarist Mick Barnard. Both options proved unsatisfactory. In December, Gabriel spotted an ad in Melody Maker placed by Steve Hackett that read, "Imaginative guitarist-writer seeks involvement with receptive musicians, determined to strive beyond existing stagnant music forms." The guitarist joined the band in January of 1971. The classic lineup of Genesis was now in place and cut its teeth touring as a support act to Lindisfarne and Van der Graaf Generator. It also appeared on the Reading Festival in June. Immediately afterwards, in July of 1971, the band began writing and rehearsing material for a new album at Luxford House, a historic country house owned by Tony Stratton Smith, an hour's drive south of London. The next month, they recorded an album at Trident Studios in London, again with John Anthony engineering and producing, plus David Henshill as assistant engineer. The resulting album, Nursery Cryme, once more with a colourful cover by Paul Whitehead, was released in November of 1971. Nursery Cryme is the first album by the classic Genesis lineup, and is also the first on which the band has managed to fully realise its prog rock direction. The most ear-catching and influential of the songs on the album is the musical box. Over 10 minutes long, it incorporates several different sections, starting with a folk-like 12-string guitar intro based on a song idea written by Phillips and Rutherford. In addition to the 12-string guitar, Rutherford also played a Dutron Mr. Bassman bass pedal synth to take care of the bass parts. Steve Hackett developed his lead guitar solos in the musical box from guitar parts written by Anthony Phillips and Mick Barnard, while adding his own approach, which included the first known incidence of string tapping on an electric guitar in a rock context several years before Eddie Van Halen. In addition to his lead vocals, Gabriel played flute and oboe, instruments that he had learned on top of his skills as a drummer and a keyboardist. Other notable and now classic tracks on Nursery Cryme include The Return of the Giant Hogweed and The Mountain of Salmachus. However, it was the musical box that attracted the most attention, and that the band has most often performed live. Genesis had by now become an impressive live act, and during a concert in September of 1972 in Dublin, Gabriel added another element to their live performances that was as attention-grabbing as it became influential. During the end of the performance of the musical box, Gabriel came on stage wearing a red dress and a fox's head, as can be seen in this excerpt from a concert in Paris a few months later. The band was as surprised and as shocked as the audience, but any resistance on the part of Gabriel's band members quickly evaporated when the press reported extensively on the stunt. It even resulted in the front cover of The Melody Maker, and the band was able to double its concert fee. From this point onwards, Gabriel often wore theatrical stage outfits, all of which added to a sense of drama of the band's performances and garnered a lot of publicity. This was much needed as their album sales in the UK were still poor, despite substantial success in Italy. Gabriel's red dress and fox mask were an impersonation of the main figure on the cover of the band's next album, Foxtrot, which was released in October of 1972. The band's fourth album signified another creative and commercial step upwards. Tony Stratton Smith had tears in his eyes on hearing the album, saying, "Everything that one had believed about the band had come through." It was the band's first album to enter the higher regions of the UK album chart, reaching to number 12. Foxtrot was in part written in a room of the Una Billings School of Dance in Shepherd's Bush in West London, to the distant sound of tap dancing coming from upstairs, which proved strangely inspiring for the quintet. Recording took place immediately afterwards during August and September at Island Records in London, with two new faces in the studio. Initial sessions with former producer John Anthony did not work out, nor did attempts to work with two other producers, first Bob Potter and then Tony Platt. Genesis ended up co-producing Foxtrot with David Hitchcock, who had been an engineer on the Nursery Cryme sessions, and at this point had produced albums for Caravan and East of Eden. I love Caravan. John Burns, who had worked with Jethro Tull and Blind Faith, stepped in as an engineer. The two standout tracks on Foxtrot are Watcher of the Skies and the 23-minute Supper's Ready, which is a suite of 7 connected songs. Watcher of the Skies takes its title from a sonnet by John Keats from 1817 and prominently features a mellotron that Tony Banks had bought from King Crimson. Raising his eyes, behold a planet unknown. Peter Gabriel has over several decades declared that Supper's Ready is one of his favourite pieces of music by Genesis. Most fans and reviewers agree that the suite is extraordinary. It's been named a towering achievement of prog rock. Hackett suggested the idea of an extended piece of work inspired by the way the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's and King Crimson in live performance link songs together. In a recent interview, Hackett recalled,
live, I said to Genesis, I wonder if we could do a really long piece of music, provided we do it right with all the bells and whistles, we can make this work. Right. But at that point, we didn't necessarily possess all the things in the armory that would make that possible. The mellotron, the synthesizer, a light show. In fact, it's pre-synthesizer. It wasn't until the following year that we were using a monophonic, tiny synthesizer. But with a mellotron and a light show and a front man who's depicting the action, prepared to act it, live the songs, etc. Supper's Ready was born. It was written in 2 weeks, and there were sections that had already existed, the fireman section, and various people brought in various bits to say we can do this and we can link it, and we took a chance and we did it. And when it was all done, I wasn't sure if our record company, let alone the fans, were going to buy into this. I thought maybe they're going to say, well, you've gone too far this time, guys. It's all over.
The song became another live favourite, with frontman Gabriel theatrically depicting the lyrics in various ways, as can be seen here.
A flower?
Reviews for Foxtrot at the time were mostly positive, with reactions like almost the perfect album, a milestone, and a creative peak, although some people have pointed out to the uneven quality of some of the songs on side one. Live, Gabriel expanded on his theatrical outfits with fluorescent face paint, a cape with bat wings, and an old man mask for the musical box. Genesis's imposing live reputation was further enhanced by the release of Genesis Live in July of 1973, which had been recorded in Manchester and Leicester in the UK in February of that year by engineer Alan Perkins, using the Pi Mobile recording unit. John Burns mixed the multitrack tapes. Genesis Live was released as a budget album and reached to number 9 in the UK. In a far cry from today's habit of releasing an album every few years, in the early 70s, albums were released at a rate of 1 or 2 albums a year, and Genesis Live was meant to be a placeholder to keep fans happy until the release of the band's 5th album, Selling England by the Pound, later in the same year. After the success of Foxtrot, Genesis signed a new deal with Charisma and given more time to record its next album. Rutherford considered this the kiss of death. But in fact, Selling England by the Pound is widely regarded as the pinnacle of Genesis' pure prog rock years and as one of the best prog rock albums of all time. Hairs are standing on end. The band wrote and rehearsed new material at a house in Kingston upon Thames, and again at Una Billings' dance school in Shepherd's Bush, and recorded it in August of 1973 at Island Studios. John Burns was once more co-producing with the band, as he had done on Genesis Live. Rhett Davies was assistant engineer and would go on to work extensively with King Crimson, Roxy Music, and Brian Ferry. Burns and Davies' contribution to Selling England by the Pound made it the best-sounding Genesis album until that point. Steve Hackett later stated that he was influenced by John McLaughlin and the Mahavishnu Orchestra. And some of the licks and riffs he supplied for the new album resulted in sections that came close to fusion music. This is particularly in evidence in the album's opener, Dancing with the Moonlit Night. The song starts with arguably one of the most beautiful and moving vocal melodies ever recorded, written by Gabriel with lyrics that embody the English theme of the album. Gabriel starts singing, "Can you tell me where my country lies?" And the verse culminates with the album's title, Selling England by the Pound, a line borrowed from the Labour Party's election manifesto at the time.
Selling England by the pound.
Steve Hackett explained the structure of the song in an interview, saying, Dancing with the Moonlight Night went from Scottish plainsong to something Elgarian, to something futuristic, touching on fusion and other forms that still haven't been named. It's also got tapping and some octave jumps and sweep picking and techniques that have become part of the glossary of terms for modern-day shredders. Hackett can be seen tapping in this live clip from 1973. Another highlight of Selling England by the Pound is the track Firth of Fifth. He had presented an early version to the band during the Foxtrot sessions, but it was rejected. The updated version is nearly 10 minutes long and features an amazing extended piano introduction by Banks and a lengthy guitar solo by Hackett that is regarded as one of his best ever. The way he bends one of the notes against a backdrop of mellotron is widely regarded as one of the ultimate chicken skin moments in music. Firth of Fifth has been called one of the finest 9.5 minutes of music that Genesis ever put down, and to also feature a synth solo by Banks using the trumpet preset of an ARP Pro soloist. It was the first synthesizer Banks acquired, and he used it in many places on the album. The Cinema Show features a 4.5 minute solo by him on the ARP Pro. The instrument is also audible in The Battle of Epping Forest, another quintessential English song about gangland warfare in northeast London, with Gabriel characterising various characters over the course of its near 12-minute length. The energetic rhythms have also elements of fusion music. The ARP Pro makes an appearance in I Know What I Like, in Your Wardrobe, as well. The song is arguably the first genuine pop song this lineup of Genesis ever recorded. It was based on a guitar riff by Hackett, developed during band improvisation. The song also features Rutherford on electric sitar, Gabriel playing an African talking drum, and Banks using a low note on the mellotron to approximate the sound of a lawnmower, which is mentioned in the lyrics and depicted on the now classic cover by painter Betty Swanwick. I Know What I Like was the first Genesis song to enter the UK singles charts, reaching to number 21. Selling England by the Pound was released in October of 1973 and became the first genuine hit album for the band, reaching number 3 in the UK album chart. Critical reaction was overwhelmingly positive, and to this day regularly makes top 10 best prog rock albums of all time. Numerous musicians have made reference to Selling England by the Pound, including John Lennon, who said during a radio interview that he loved the album. Steve Hackett commented, "It doesn't get much better than that. A tribute from Lennon. The great man himself listened to our records. It gave us a heck of a buzz and real encouragement." Suitably encouraged, Genesis toured in support of the album from September 1973 to May of 74, with Gabriel appearing in various outfits to illustrate the lyrics. For example, a helmet, a shield, and a suit with a British flag, and a cape in Dancing with the Moonlit Night. Genesis appeared to have the world at its feet when it began work on its next album in June of 1974, immediately after touring. However, trouble was brewing. Some of the band members had become irritated by the fact Gabriel was more and more seen as the leader of Genesis by the members of the press, an impression that was strengthened in live performance by Gabriel's eye-catching costumes and theatrics. It put him very much in the limelight, and especially as the rest of the band was always seated and often in semi-darkness. Genesis decided that it wanted its next album to be a concept double album, and eventually settled on a story devised by Gabriel about Rael, a young Puerto Rican living in New York City, who embarks on a journey that sees him encountering all manner of surreal, dreamlike circumstances. Gabriel wanted the underlying themes and imagery to be American, in contrast to the Englishness of Selling England by the Pound. Having written the story, Gabriel insisted on writing all the lyrics, which caused a degree of separation with the rest of the band. The writing sessions took place at Headley Grange, an English country house where Led Zeppelin recorded several of its albums. But Gabriel was pulled elsewhere because of an issue with his wife's pregnancy and giving birth, as well as an invitation to write a screenplay by William Friedkin, the American director who that year enjoyed a hit film with The Exorcist. It came to nothing, but it meant the rest of the band often wrote material without Gabriel present, including some of the lyrics. After 3 months of sometimes tortuous writing sessions, the band moved to a country house in Wales, where they started recording, using equipment rented from Island Studios in London. John Burns was again producing, with David Hutchings engineering. The equipment used included 2 3M 24-track tape recorders, a 30-input Helios electronics mixing desk, Altec monitors, and 2-track A62 Studer tape recorders. The company used some of the natural surroundings to create special effects. For example, some vocals were recorded in a cowshed and some in a bathroom. Keyboardist Tony Banks also noted the band used a lot of moods. At times, things were little more than improvisations on an idea. Tracks like The Waiting Room and Ravine ended up being mostly atmospheric soundscapes, with Banks using ARP 2600 synth to great effect. Flying on a Windshield also came out of a collective improvisation. The dramatic moment the rhythm section comes in became a particular favourite of band and fans. The album's mixdown took place at Island Studios. Brian Eno happened to be working on a solo album in the studio, and he contributed vocal effects on some of the tracks. When The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway was finally released on November the 18th, 1974, with a largely black and white cover that was very different from its earlier albums, the band feared critical slaughter. However, critical reaction was overwhelmingly positive. The album has since gone on to be highly regarded and, like its predecessor, is regularly included in the top 10 of the best prog rock albums of all time. Standout tracks are the opening title track, In the Cage, Back in NYC, The Carpet Crawlers, and The Lamia. Genesis toured in support of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway in North America from November 74 to February of 1975, and until the end of May that year in Europe. The band played the whole of the album live, with encores of 2 older tracks. In a precursor of modern multimedia live shows, the stage design had 3 screens that showed almost 1,500 slides and laser lights. Gabriel was wearing some of his most outlandish costumes, and with the slideshow often failing and Gabriel having problems getting the microphone close to his mouth in one costume, the show had overtones of Spinal Tap.
I think it kind of culminated, though, for me personally, in the Slipperman costume, though, because at that point, like, I was very much, a musician in this band, and and this was starting to piss me off a bit, because Peter wasn't able to get a microphone close enough to his mouth half the time in that costume to actually do what he was supposed to be doing, which was singing.
The rift that opened up between Gabriel and the rest of the band during the writing and recording of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway led to the singer's departure at the end of the tour. He informed the band of his intention at the beginning of the tour, but the news was not announced publicly until August of 1975. Fans and critics wondered whether Genesis could survive without Gabriel. One prominent music magazine went as far as openly declaring the band dead. However, the singer himself always maintained that he had no doubts, as the other band members are excellent songwriters. The band itself was also confident of its abilities and of the band's future, despite having accumulated £400,000 in debt, the equivalent of £3 million in today's money. When the remaining 4 members reconvened in the summer, top-quality new material quickly emerged, including large parts of what would become Squonk and Dance on a Volcano. The band and producer and engineer, David Henschel, went into Trident Studios in London in October of 1975 to record the new album. Most of the material had been written by that stage, but the band still had no idea who was going to be the singer. The backing tracks were recorded without vocals, and an ad asking for a vocalist was placed in Melody Maker. It received 400 replies, and a large number of vocalists were auditioned, but nobody suitable emerged. Eventually, Phil Collins was persuaded to sing the lead vocals on Squonk. His performance was so convincing that he ended up recording the lead vocals on the rest of the songs as well.
It seems so obvious now, doesn't it? You had a singer in the group and everything already. But, Peter had all sorts of things that sort of came with him, and it was just like thinking of Phil. I don't know, I wasn't sure.
The resulting album, A Trick of the Tail, was released on February the 2nd, 1976. Despite the pressure of Gabriel leaving the band and having substantial debt, the band surprised everyone by sounding better than ever before, with many top-notch songs enhanced by excellent production. Most reviews were positive, and the music is often described as more of a continuation of Selling England by the Pound than that of The Lamb. Standout tracks of A Trick of the Tail included Dance on a Volcano, Squonk, and Los Endos. The band for the first time created promotional videos for the album's title track, Ripples, and Robbery, Assault and Battery. The album did well commercially, going to number 3 in the UK album charts and number 1 in France. It also reached number 31 in the US. The sales allowed the band to pay back part of its debt. Genesis toured the album from March to July of 1976. Collins was nervous about being frontman and combining drumming and singing. He asked drummer Bill Bruford to come on tour, having played with him already in the band Brand X. Bruford was well known for his work with Yes and King Crimson, and a natural choice. His presence led to the band often playing with two drummers on stage. Tony Banks' touring keyboard arsenal had by this time extended to an ARP Pro soloist, Hammond T102 organ, Mellotron M400 Mark II, and an RMI 368X electro piano that had a Fender Blender fuzz pedal built in. Banks also ran his RMX and Hammond keyboards through an MXR Phase 100 pedal. Steve Hackett often played a 1957 Gibson Les Paul Goldtop around this time, and after 1976 also a Fender Stratocaster with a Musitronics Gizmotron for violin-like sustain. In the 70s, Hackett used an HH Electronic IC100S guitar amp head and Marshall amps, and his pedals included at various times an Echoplex, MXR Phase 90, Marshall Super Fuzz, Crybaby Wah Wah, Color Sound Octavider, Shaftesbury Duo Fuzz, Vox Wah Wah, Color Sound Super Tone Bender, Apollo Fuzz, Ernie Ball Volume Pedal, and a Synthy Hi-Fly. He used a Zematus 12-string live, and in the studio also a Yairi classical guitar. Because he was regularly switching between bass and 12-string guitar, Rutherford also became known for his double-neck guitars. In the early Genesis days, he had played a Gibson EBO bass, followed by a Rickenbacker 4001. He also had a Rickenbacker 360 12-string, and ended up duct taping the two instruments together. It was obviously not very stable or practical, so in 1972 he had asked luthier Dick Knight to join the two instruments permanently together. Rutherford later played another double-necked instrument made by Knight that combined a Rickenbacker 4080 12-string semi-hollow body with a micro-fret short-scale 6-string bass guitar. During the Trick of the Tail tour, he briefly used a double-necked guitar custom-made for him by Knight, and soon after he used a Shergold twin guitar that could be separated into a 12-string and a bass. Rutherford's guitar and bass pedals at the time included a Screaming Bird treble booster, Roland Space Echo, Roland Chorus, MXR Flanger, MXR Fuzzbox, and MXR Graphic Equalizer, and a Color Sound Super Tone Bender. When Rutherford played 12-string, he often used Moog Taurus bass pedals. His Zematus 12-string acoustic guitar had a de-Armand pickup. At the end of the tour in the summer of 1976, the band spent a considerable amount of time writing new material. In an echo of what had happened with Peter Gabriel during the writing of The Lamb Lies Down in Broadway, the band now experienced friction with Hackett. The guitarist had released his first solo album in 1975, Voyage of the Acolyte, which had been well received and wanted more of his material recorded on the new album. He also objected to the lyrics becoming more straightforward and the songs shorter, but was outvoted on both fronts. His song Please Don't Touch was rehearsed but not recorded, and he released it in 1978 as the title track of his second album. Recordings for what was to become the final studio album with Hackett took place at Relight Studios in Hilvarenbeek in the south of the Netherlands during September and October of 1976, with David Henschel again co-producing with the band. The recordings were mixed at Trident Studios in London. Wind and Wuthering was released on December 17, 1976, and was positively received by fans and most critics. It reached number 6 in the UK charts and number 26 in the US. Standout tracks include 11th Earl of Mar, One for the Vine, In That Quiet Earth, and Afterglow. However, there was also a sense of Genesis having mined the prog rock genre to the point of diminishing returns, and not yet being quite clear where to go next. They also rather obviously were out of touch with the punk and new wave genres that came up in the second half of the 70s. It all meant that change was inevitable. Songs on Wind and Wuthering like Your Own Special Way and Blood on the Rooftops, and the shorter tracks on the EP of album outtakes Spot the Pigeon, released in March of 1977, pointed the way to the prog pop that was soon to follow. Genesis toured in support of the album from January to July of 1977, with Chester Thompson as an additional drummer. Thompson had previously worked with Frank Zappa and Weather Report. The band had developed an elaborate light show for the Wind and Wuthering tour and played in larger venues than ever before. Their live double album Seconds Out was recorded during the 4 nights of the Paris leg of the tour in June of 1977 and released in October of that year.
I managed to let off steam by doing a solo album, which was successful. And it created a difficult situation within the band because the band perceived it as a threat. So there was pressure on me to give up the solo career. And I said, fine, okay, provided a percentage of what I do is done by the band, and the band said, well, we don't really do things like that. We do it by committee. So it was a very difficult decision, and it took me over 2 years of agonizing about that decision, but I felt that the band was no longer a healthy musical climate for me.
Just like Gabriel, Hackett decided he wanted to leave the band during a tour that he had then completed. The guitarist quit during the mixing of the live album. Also like Peter Gabriel, Steve Hackett went on to enjoy a successful solo career. However, Banks, Rutherford and Collins did not miss a beat. Within weeks of Hackett's departure, they were already back in the same studio in the Netherlands where Wind and Wuthering had been recorded, laying down material for the band's 9th studio album. And then there were 3 in 1978. But this is the beginning of the story of our Genesis Part 2 video. With Hackett's departure from the group, the pure prog rock era of Genesis had come to an end. For a number of years, prog rock and Genesis were regarded, in the UK at least, as decidedly uncool. However, over time, the prog rock incarnation of Genesis has become widely admired. It continues to have a foundational influence on the entire genre, and the list of musicians who have been influenced by the band and are proud to say so continues to grow. It includes members of Queen, Rush, Iron Maiden, Van Halen, Simple Minds, Radiohead, Marillion, Tool, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Dream Theater, Fish, the Mars Volta, Elbow, and many, many more. There have also been countless awards. For example, the Lifetime Achievement Award at the Progressive Music Awards in 2012. Perhaps the main testimony to the quality of Genesis music from 1970 to 1977 is that it still sounds entirely relevant today. Oddly enough, more than Genesis itself, it has been Steve Hackett who has been most instrumental in keeping the legacy of early Genesis alive, with his Genesis Revisited projects, which started with an album in 1996, and that he has since 2013 regularly taken on tour, attracting larger and larger live audiences. A series of increasingly popular live recordings of these concerts has been released, most recently his live version of Seconds Out. Many people clearly second what Hackett said in a recent interview about the music of early Genesis. It sounds better and better with the passing of time. Thanks ever so much for watching part 1. Genesis, from the beginning right through to 77, is still some of the greatest music ever made, some of my favorite music ever made. However, all of Genesis music is important to me. And the fact that they continue to grow from strength to strength, and all of the members' solo careers grew from strength to strength. I mean, we haven't even got into Phil Collins going solo and just how big he became, but Peter Gabriel became huge. Steve Hackett's solo albums were also incredibly successful. What a breeding ground of incredible talent this band was. Stay tuned for part 2. That'll be coming out in a week or 2. Thanks ever so much for watching. So long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, au revoir, adios, ciao, goodbye.